Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, for the invitation. And I'm going to just talk about two projects, really, that illustrate a journey in education in ceramics, because it's a two-way thing. One starts with little idea, and you slowly develop a kind of itinerary. But actually, and so I was, ceramics. I was going to start with actually a very nice quote from Lucy Rye, great potter, who said, "To make pottery is an adventure to me. Every new work is a new beginning." And I think that's very much the case with this material. But in fact, actually, as I think about it, from my own perspective, this represents a kind of desire that I had when I found myself teaching in Cambridge, so taken on back in 1983, and finding myself determined to try and make a bridge there between history and theory and construction. And these two worlds, are curiously divided. And I think the ensemble here, as I understand it, freshly, of students, of practitioners, of those in the industry, of no doubt, our minds, the enablers being the clients and developers who want to use or are enabled to use the material through us. This is a bridge. It's a massive number of bridges of the most incredibly important kind. So I think I'd like just to celebrate that too on the basis of what's been said. I wanted to, where am I going? Let me use this perhaps. Right click, left click, there we go. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that background of making bridges and the interest in materials, actually. This is a drawing I made, I guess you can see it, with a fellow, a student, back in '85, of Victor Horta's Hotel Tassel, which is like the birth of Art Nouveau in a way. It was a building that had been turned into, multi-let, as degenerated, and 1894 in origin, and then had been put lovingly back together by a group in Brussels, and was about to become the Mexican consulate, as it happened. So we tore in and drew this kind of one-to-one almost, and then made this drawing. The thing about this building, as you can see from the plan, is that actually it's a building between two party walls, very tight. It was for an academic. It was also at the time, obviously, of symbolist poetry, of interest in psychoanalysis and the interior. But it's also the first domestic building to use metal, and the metal opened up the entire world in this. And so if I was to talk about metal, I would be starting with, no doubt, Horta. I would then be moving to, the inevitable sequence of the use of metal with Pierre Charot and the Maison de Verre. And always, I suppose, what I'm saying is thinking about the use of material in its cultural context, because these moments, are fascinating in terms of the way that they tune in to a particularity of place. You wouldn't have Victor Horta and the Hotel Tassel without party walls and terraces and a particular urban structure. It wouldn't make sense. So I suppose the question I ask is when we think about ceramics, how do we culturally think about ceramics? Where is it critical? And so from my own background, I spent a year actually looking at nomadism in Iran. But these is a page, couple of pages from a sketchbook from 1974 in Yazd in Iran. And you get up into this world, which it's basically a desert city, so it's built into the ground with these famous badgir, the wind catchers, which you can see in the silhouette of distant hills. The water comes underground to cisterns, so that everything is subterranean, but then it bursts vertically, and it does it in this incredible way, this way that is something about the baked earth, domes, a lack of timber in that circumstance, the earth, and then the sky, and how one mediates between the two. There's this incredible tradition in Islamic architecture, and particularly in Iran. If you've been anyone to Isfahan, of these extraordinary ceramic-clad earth structures that give protection, but also amazing beauty in terms of their craftsmanship, and incorporate in them, given the question of iconography and Islam, in word and in calligraphy and in plants, a kind of heavenly place on earth. It's really, a very, very potent condition or example of the use of ceramics. Before I just dive into those two projects, my first then attempt to use ceramics in a building was actually at this project for an art school, Wimbledon School of Art, and working with an artist, sadly no longer with us, John Mitchell. And we worked out this kind of condition of this wall and a graded glaze in blue and red over 5 sections that raised through the wall. And this was the first introduction to me to Shores of Darwin, who were one of the actors in our own passage as a practice in terms of the use of ceramic. So Shores of Darwin no longer with us as in that particular guise, have moved on, but still working up there in Lancashire. It was a very interesting manifestation in that world of art. But these two projects begin with this one, which you can't yet see, but based in Bath. I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural context, because that's why, in this instance, I started to think of ceramics, obviously with those resonances from previous experience behind me. But this is an extraordinary place. It's a museum now. It became a museum in the early part of the 20th century. Before that, it was a kind of casino. It was a entrance. Those 3 arched openings at the base led to something incredibly interesting on the other side. Actually, this entire street, which is about 400 meters long, called Great Pulteney Street in Bath, in the southwest of England, is a causeway. It's built up in this over this marshy landscape to enter this building, which you'll see here. Within Bath, obviously, it's a very artificial. It's a sort of Las Vegas, I guess, of Britain at that point. It's a spa town, known to the Romans because of the waters. Then for 50 years, kind of, the impresario was Beau Nash, who presided over the season in this extraordinary town. The bit we're looking at is this length here. You've just seen the perspective down the street. It starts with a beautiful Adam Bridge over the river, and then it ends in this lozenge. And you'll see, even in, maybe you can just see in within the lozenge, there's a sort of intestinal-shaped garden, which is actually a pleasure garden. So the pleasure garden in the English context in the 18th century, particularly, is very important. There were pre-railways. You couldn't get to the coast. You couldn't get to the edges further afield. So the pleasure garden was a place that in twilight, would become full of apparent bird song, actually completely artificial. You'd have an orchestra in there somewhere. You had this scene. So you went from that classical facade through the building, and you came out onto the other side to these dining boxes that were a great arc on either side, and there was then a veil, and you heard music, and the music was coming from the band that was playing above you, and it was all about the inversion. It was the artificiality of pleasure within a town, so an artificial nature. You can just see actually in this image, off in the distance somewhere here, swings. And actually Jane Austen lived in a house just on one side of the lozenge for a number of years and wrote about it. It would be full of fireworks. There was, there were all sorts of kind of eccentricities going on. But then in it declined with the railways, obviously, and it became this rather dull facade by a worthy architect who changed the building to house a very beautiful little collection of a traveller called William Holborn. So it's a museum now called the Holborn Museum. But they needed desperately to kind of, nobody was coming down the street. The gardens remain as a ghost, but not in purpose. And they needed more space. So there was a competition. And this was my idea for the competition, for an extension at the back at twilight, because the condition is that this is northeast facing. So you don't get sun in there, but at evening it becomes potentially a magical place. My first instinct was not to use ceramics. It was glass, it was timber behind, but it was this idea that you would be going from a kind of a rather solemn classical exterior into this wonderful garden. So, just very briefly, the existing condition was the building left by Blomfield, and he had blocked the axis through which you used to come. So one of our jobs was to pull the stair. This is a listed building, so it's kind of sacrosanct, to one side, so you re-engage that passage. I'm not going to dwell on it at great length. And then you proceed upstairs. There are these, he did bequeath some very beautiful big rooms, and connectivity across the garden is uppermost. So this was my first sketch, and I was interested in reflection and something that would levitate. So this first sketch was about a tripartite idea, remembering that competition sketch, which had got to the point of thinking about a closed box at the top, which was top lit, but as an exhibition space, temporary exhibitions upon which the lifeblood of a small museum works, housing the Holborn Museum, the original collection in between here, and then a very open public space at the bottom. And I started to think about ceramic, and that was an interesting perception, intuition. This is the section through the historic building and the new building with these levels. I say it was interesting because, touching this building, and conservation is very big, and here I know, but also in the UK. And I think at the first planning application, we had 1,200 respondents. Probably that doesn't sound like a lot, but 1,200 people writing, mostly to bitterly complain. And so it failed on the first round and then finally got through. But it was about inverting the idea, because it's a Janus-headed project, classical frontage, pleasure garden on the other. Stone works in a way that gathers weight to rustication from the urns that are the connection to the sky. Ceramic, I was very happy to levitate. It's somehow artificial, so this idea of ceramic was interesting me. But in the first instance, the powers that be determined that if it was going to be ceramic, then it should look like stone. So there's a big problem. So this drawing is about the difficulty of that. And I needed darkness to reflect the trees and the sense of nature and to give a kind of mystery. So anyway, so it is to Shores of Darwin, who won the contract. It's slip-form material. They produced some early glazes, which were very light. I was talking about the ambiguity of the color of the eye that has a certain kind of depth. The character of the surface. So I was interested in depth, but I wasn't getting there. And then we started to get to where I wanted, which was a manganese oxide, deeper color underneath, and a titanium white that was placed on top. So the left-hand sample begins to get closer to where I wanted to. And I persuaded the people that the buttery stone of Bath isn't necessarily the case when you get to the north-facing shadowed world. I mean, stone is not something that is uniform. So I was arguing this as a way of progressing. So to the construction drawing, which is essentially, I didn't want the exhibition of a grid, as it were, on the ceramic. So these finials cover the vertical grid and allow a kind of ordering that is vertical to exist. So on the outside of the top layer, the secondary layer has an inner lining of ceramic panels, all slip-formed. And then below that, it's glass and glass, it's glass and ceramic, it's ceramic. So it's that tripartite sketch starts to manifest itself in this way. And this was the process that we know, understanding it, everyone is focused around the material in the room. And then the question of how the glazes, so a double glazed, once fired technique developed to create that sort of sense of lack of consistency. It's using the glaze as something haptic, crafted, and here the finished article sitting in its garden setting. The thing that this doesn't show is that because of there's something very beautiful about being in the space with the movement of trees that immediately gets picked up in the ceramic and the glass in different ways, creating very interesting shadows. So there's a depth, there's a layering, there's a sense of protection of the very precious things that are within. That changes through the seasons and through the day. So the result has a certain kind of, maybe going back to that sketch, an idea. The structure is taken off the corners so that the bottom works with the environmental glass behind and a veil of glass drawn down on the outside. To create the calibration vertically in that tripartite way and to create this resonance with the landscape. So in fact, that the project has become quite accepted, even though it had that rocky kind of start. And it's had some great shows around ceramics within it. So Grayson Perry, a wonderful show of his pots and other elements. Lucy Rye, there's also Felicity Aycliffe and her huge Chinese vessels. But at the moment there's a show of Lucy Rye's wonderful work, an Austrian potter who started life with Joseph Hoppmann in Vienna, part of the Vienna Werkstätte, and then spent her life post 38 in the UK. So it's wonderful. I'm not talking about our use and thinking of ceramic and colour tonight, but just two images. We have done quite a lot of work with colour. This one with Richard Deacon. This is a dry lay of a frieze, which ends up on this building in Piccadilly Circus, right in the heart of London. Totally artificial place. It's about the illuminations. It's about reflection in that. It's this bouquet that Richard kind of made on the building. And equally with Kumela, thinking back to actually that Islamic work, this is a roof to a music performance space at a college in Brighton, using 4-inch square tiles with different finishes, like that first project at Wimbledon. So the question of colour is there. I'm not talking about that tonight. But it's actually, I want to talk a little bit more about how the material works. Slip forming is incredibly sculptural, and the beauty in it is elements like these knees, which would be impossible with extrusion. I mean, I know you can glue bits of extrusion together and miter them, so that's not a world I want to get into. But essentially, slip form is something that allows you the viscosity of form in an extraordinary way. I know we're all dealing with that in the performances and the work and the research that's going on at the moment for this wonderful festival, as it were, of ceramic. But the other question in my mind is where can you take the material as extruded? So the Holborn was small, quite expensive. Piccadilly was expensive. It's all hand set in lime mortar, so your substrate has to be very strong, in the tradition of the use of faience in steel frame buildings. We had another challenge in Birmingham. This is Birmingham, UK, with a set of buildings, new buildings near the historic centre. I'm just showing an early sketch, which was the plan form, or an idea for a plan form for a building that sat on its own, but wanted to respond to a lot of different tensions around the site. So I thought of this kind of more organic approach to it. So how to, with the budget, use a material, a ceramic material that it's extruded, that could actually work as something curved and be assembled in an interesting way. So on the top right, you see a section of a radius that we built in our studio, with sections of a sill. This was the successful dimension for this radius of about just under 400 millimeters, where the eye could be deceived with the shadow being faceted, but actually appearing on that radius. It was close to historic buildings, so there's a kind of thinking about the glaze as a simple glaze, learning a little bit from earlier on. This is undertaken with MBK, So another one of the handful of greats in terms of production, doing a lot of, coming out of the baguette of Renzo Piano, and his Berlin project, maybe rain screens that are so popular. But thinking about it, actually, they're supporting fins, and the fins are made up of three sections of ceramic to look stronger or heavier than they otherwise would be. It's a 1.5 meter, so a 5 meter grid, effectively. There is no curved glass in the building. It's all faceted, but it's put together in such a way that it works through the extrusion with a flat surface. So here's part of that building. The only bits that are curved are the precast at the base, and it's for a very economical budget. And we took that in a way to this last project, so I shan't detain you much longer. And obviously happy to take any, do interrupt if there are questions, and we can take some questions at the end if you will. But I want to take you to a project that's completed a couple of years ago now. Bath goes back, way back to 2005, I think, or thereabouts. So this project is fairly recent and takes that idea of the extruded material on a curved surface a little further. So in Singapore, it was a competition. It's in a Zaha Hadid master plan for this sort of technology park. And they came up, Hadid's came up with a very good, I mean, you know, I think very fortunate for a designer, set of principles. One is that because this particular building is next to a park, that the public had to be able to walk under the building with a soffit at about 10 meters, and because it faced the park, it couldn't have too heavy a frontage to the park. So inevitably there was a sense of stepping back and lifting. So that's where we got to, but effectively it developed with this idea of passage of these structures, which are trees that pick up a 9-meter grid to a standard office plate above this, with two pods, one which contains an auditorium and is more introverted, and the other that is quite the opposite. It's about connecting, and then the public are walking through and under the building. So yeah, these were just my initial thoughts about it, that you could have a cushion almost that had the entrance and the auditorium. You could have a woven basket on this side, within which there are two cores, and then there are these inverted pyramids structurally that pick up in order to make a big dimension underneath for the public to pass through, and then it's stepping back. It's a large footplate, so allowing light through it, and planting those terraces to. Which they do incredibly well in Singapore. Sort of the sense of the world of laboratory and office that this building is. It's about the agricultural world, and so a sense of terracing again seemed a good response with landscaping. And in the first instance, then, in my mind, it was a bit like a set of crockery that was stacked with large overhangs to create the protection that's absolutely necessary in that latitude to create shadow, so that to reduce the impact of solar gain. And so this was the initial model from that competition. And at this stage, to be honest, that the edge was indeterminate. There's a sense of of creating these edges that are curved, responding to that organic plan form, that would be cantilevered more than 2 meters beyond the perimeter of the building, that would also then allow the terracing and vegetation to be part of the building. And this was the CGI of the cushion. Looking at the Bean of Anish Kapoor in Chicago yesterday, which I hadn't visited since it was, I mean, wow, what a spectacular piece that is. I shared a flat with Anish in my early days, so it was really rather wonderful to see that piece. But we couldn't do that because of reflection. They're very sensitive about reflection, so it cooled down. But the principle very much maintained. But the idea was, learning from Birmingham a bit, that actually we would create these projections and then create that setting of extruded material that is then cut to radius, glazed, and then assembled, with obviously a sensible number of radii to deal with, and then create the edging to soften that, and then work through the glaze. So actually, in the prototyping, question of how the joints would work. The beauty of this is that rather than bringing, a large piece of material to site and then having a very strong joint that would have been the case with sheet material, with ceramic, there's something very beautiful about this. Isn't as big as it could be, but at the same time, the joints are continuous. So it's like a textile. It's like it has a sort of sense of being one, which is very interesting about the modularity of the material, I think. And some elements that are more like shipbuilding, like these trees, and the lightness of the weave of the basket. And indeed, this is working with a company called CN Terracotta, north of Shanghai. So working through with some of the glazes we'd developed in Birmingham, and this is the finished product. So it sits within this park landscape, but sets back and gives access for the office, everyone in the office, to these terraces, which is, it's an incredibly important thing these days. Certainly with our projects in London post-COVID, being able to get outside the enclosed, confined working space, and that works very beautifully here. And so this is the way it developed through its various levels, and here the finished product, which also under the trees has this soffit of ceramic that runs under the belly of the building. So we just end a very short movie around the project to give you a sense of it in use. Very soon those trees will be shooting through this space, I'm sure. So yeah, in summary, really, it's just, these are crafted finishes rather than artistic finishes. And then about the techniques that I know, I mean, there may be others out there that are related to either a bit like masonry, where you have walling masons and banker masons and carver masons With ceramic, you know, the molding and the slip form is one, the extrusion is another, and obviously, you know, here we are in Buffalo. You know, the fabulous possibilities of sculpting, crafting, relief, molding that is just part of the wonderful world of ceramics. Thank you very much.
Susan Tunick, Friends of Terracotta. Thank you for that presentation. I just was wondering, in this office building, what did you end up with the glaze? It was hard to tell. You had a number of choices, but is it pretty much all white, or what was the surface?
The surface is a double glaze, once fired. So very much like Birmingham, actually. It's slightly whiter here, given its relationship to the very green nature and verdant nature of the parkland, whereas Birmingham is tuned to a limestone in a way. It's not ersatz, but it's just working within a field there. And so this is a continuation, as I say. It's therefore very varied, actually, in a limited way, and it's down to crafting rather than artistry, I would say.
And what was your experience with the Chinese company? It was a good experience?
Yeah, they did pretty well, I would say. I don't mean that to sound in any way patronizing. They were really full on in terms of their willingness to try something they hadn't done before. Yeah, there's an awful lot of extruded material that has to be cut pretty precisely. There was a bit of problem with quality control, but that's quite usual in a way. I mean, I love that Lucy Rye quote about adventure. If I go back to the Holborn, there was this incredible moment when we got rung up by Shores of Darwin saying, we have a problem. This material's just come out of the kiln and it's wrong. You know, it's blue, it's not green or something. And there was a hiatus, terrifying hiatus, because they couldn't proceed. You know, like if you got McAlpine, it's a contractor, heavy contractor on your back, and you know there's no material. They eventually sorted out the science. It was a bum mix, you know, of glazing material. But once that had been ironed out, it happened again. But there is this uncertainty, which I think is something to celebrate. So there's quite a lot of variation in this, in fact, if you get up close to it.
Thank you.
Alex Perzich with HGA. With this project, was there much convincing that had to be done with the client about using terracotta? And like, you feel like you have to make that kind of pitch early on in your project?
Yeah, the terracotta wasn't there at the competition. So it was, we won the competition on the basis of a kind of imprecise material development, as it were, and came to the terracotta as a way of, you know, and yes, there was a need to do a lot of persuading because of the number of units, because of the apparent complexity, but the material wins, you know, in so many ways.
Christine Jetten, Studio Christine Jetten, Place Design. Could you share something about your London building with the casted fins that moved? Because I was interested in if you could share like how that process went along in the designing of the shape in combination with what technique that was been chosen and the development of the glaze to get this entire expression.
Well, in a way, I this project has a prototype in the earlier project I showed. The one in London is in New Bond Street, and the glaze has a family connection to the Holborn because we were playing with the two. So one's in a park setting. I would have to show you the drawings, but there's something New Bond Street. Like Ginza or, any of the great shopping streets in cities, is a celebration of crafting, of making. Maybe leather, it may be, maybe paintings. It's just a place in my mind. And actually, it goes a bit further because the building next to it was a very sumptuous Edwardian building with a shoe shop at the bottom called Pinet. And the shoes in that shop would take my eye from early days. They amazing skins, amazing, And so I think that working on that, there's a big section which is a shop front. I like working with ceramics because you don't have to pretend that it's got to come to the ground. I mean, I hate using stone like bathroom tiling. Let me lay that on the table. I cannot. This idea of suspending stone on brackets just doesn't make sense to me. A stone needs to be part of the earth. Ceramic's different. That's why I wanted it in Bath, because I wanted it to be open at the bottom. And in that same way, there is a play between the inside and the outside in Bond Street with these oriel windows, which kind of give a theatricality, almost like boxes. So between them, I developed that idea of something reptilian, of a finial that moves, and in its moving, it's that bend that is just says this is sculpted, this is slip formed, this is something very different to an extruded material. So the glaze had a background in another project and a development of it. Then what you saw was there's two very interesting on that project. It's actually an urban collage because it's in behind some existing fabric as well. So there were two very interesting art commissions, and the one on that project is actually lighting, and so there is a programmed lighting capacity that allows that movement to be accentuated by night, which is I find very exciting as well.
I have to pass by at night because it's one of my favorites in London, and really it's interesting to learn about the background of how this design evolved. Because I was wondering.
Thank you. I could show you the drawings, but that's another lecture.
Yeah. Yes, next year.
Yeah. Well,
Eric, I had one question. You started to say something quite interesting about it as a material in relationship to what you just said, let's say, into the scale. That let's say the metal you could imagine would be somewhat scaleless, and this had some sense of scale. We think of the brick as immediate scale because of the hand and so forth, and when it moves outside of that proportion, but you said that about ceramics. Could you speak a little bit more to what aspect of scale or how tectonics or something that maybe you're getting at with these materials?
Yeah. Well, I think the question of joints is maybe slightly lateral response, but you walk around this building and those bricks that are 37 millimeters by 305 millimeters, 18 millimeter rake joint, create the horizontality, the emphasis. It's beautiful to see, how somebody can be so in control of the idea of jointing. I mean, this is masterwork. So I think, I mean, I could bore you forever about joints, but you know, in terms of sheet material, it's coming at a certain scale, and then you've got to work through your, so with metal, you know, you've always got to think about the processes. So one has intuitively the fact that if you're going to use vitreous enamel, you know, that's going to be a maximum height of 3 meters, and you'll get so far. It's just down to the kilns across the world at the moment. There may be bigger at some point. You know, anodizing or finishes are going to create a certain, you know, rolls of material come at a certain dimension. So you're thinking immediately, I think, as a designer, about the question of what the material can do. So extruded material, you know, I think will get you up to about, and John will correct me and team, but you know, about 1.2 possibly. You know, that's stretching it. So you know, you're going to be able to get and you know, extruded surfaces as flat surfaces have a kind of a scaling we work with that's going to be a max. That's the dimension of a joint that that's the end dimension. So the question then is what it with, you know, slip form material, what that vertical dimension would be on the Hoban, you know, as against the you know, the stacking dimension as against the fin dimension. And this question: should joints line up, or do you want the grid? You know, do you want the tyranny of the grid to dominate, or do you want to work around it? So, you know, I think that then the interesting thing here is with an organic form is the continuity of result in terms of scale, like a scaling, literally, you know, that is manifest from a thinking about the way things are fabricated. So, joints, everything.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks for the invitation.